My name is Philip Clayton, and I'm the president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization. We record this vital conversation at a critical historical moment here in the Student Union of Strathclyde University in Glasgow, at roughly the halfway point of COP26. Before I name this moment, let me introduce you to the three leaders who will be sharing their reflections with you. Raj Joshi is the founder and CEO of Bridging Ventures, and thus our host here at the Strathclyde Student Union. Thank you very much, Raj. You may know him as the lead author of the Decisive Decade Inquiry into the Future of Climate Action, which was commissioned by Christiana Figueres, the chief architect for the Paris Agreement, as part of Mission 2020. Raj previously served as the inaugural managing director of the B Team. During his years in that position, he worked across business, government, and civil society, established offices around the world, and developed global initiatives on climate action, good governance, and human rights. Raj previously led the International Secretariat of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. He was also elected to chair the Scottish Youth Parliament for 2 terms. Born in Scotland, his family is from Kenya and originates from Gujarat, India.
Woohoo!
Charmian Love is the co-founder and activist in residence at B Lab UK. She also co-chairs the B Lab's Global Climate Task Force. For her day job, as it were, Char works as social entrepreneur in residence at the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship at the Said Business School, University of Oxford, where she designed and teaches an MBA elective on regenerative and circular economy. She's also contributed to the new MBA core class, Capitalism in Debate. I'd like to take that class. In addition, she is the co-director of the newly launched Oxford Climate Emergency Program. Char's areas of expertise and advocacy include the rise of profit and purpose business, regenerative and circular economic models, systempreneurship, and how to mobilize a movement of movements. And finally, Anthony Bennett. Anthony brings to the panel a broad range of experience in the cultural, environmental, and educational sector. His career includes multiple leadership positions in the arts, resulting in his being named a Fellow of the Royal Society for Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. He has served as Director of Development at WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, board member of Islington Giving, and in numerous other positions. Anthony is currently the CEO of Reboot the Future.org, which works with multiple private and public partners to, well, reboot the future.
We'll find out today.
Yeah, right. For example, this event stems from the collaboration between Reboot and EcoCiv. With Reboot, Anthony is exploring the contributions of the Golden Rule to the Great Transition. For example, how it might help unlock the social value of the arts and heritage, how true reciprocity can lead to a sustainable and just transition, and how schools and young people around the world can become the true engines for change. Raj, Char, Anthony, how would you describe the significance of this moment? We gather at roughly the midpoint of COP. Everyone says the most important COP since 2015 in Paris. According to the BBC today, 100,000 people marched yesterday in Glasgow alone, and hundreds of thousands around the world. A week of negotiators has just finished doing technical discussions of the various documents after the heads of state have left with their stirring opening comments. The people in the street are restless. What you hear in the talks are anger and disappointment, frustration, almost hopelessness. It's a restless moment in civil society. How would you name this particular moment where we sit?
Well, I think we have reached a boiling point. The people in the streets are clear. Their demands are clear. This is not just about climate action, it's about climate justice. This is not just about climate mitigation, it's also about systems change. People realize that the system that we have is, in some ways, absolutely rigged against the many for the few. The issues of inequality and climate change can no longer be dealt with in isolation. And with 4 gigatons of carbon left to burn in the atmosphere by the end of 2030, for just a 60% chance of hitting a 1.5 degree threshold, this is the decisive decade, no doubt. Yeah. And so if you take the science, if you take the social breakdown that we're seeing in society right now, if you take the pandemic, which has left so many lives decimated, where less than 2% of the global south is still unvaccinated, many of which can't make it here. I mean, you know, as a person of color, this is the whitest COP I've ever seen. Right. And that's not just because of visa difficulties, it's because people are not vaccinated, they can't get here, their voices are not being heard. And therefore one has to also ask, you know, to what extent can we legitimately take some of the outcomes of this COP as a universal agreement?
Sure. What is this moment? Name it as you experience it. You've been on so many stages, heard so many talks.
Yeah, it's interesting when you asked this question, I didn't think about the stages. The places where I think I'm gonna struggle, because I'm not gonna name the moment. I'm instead gonna sort of share the feeling of the moment.
Good, that's better.
Because it feels like a bit more authentic to me, and I think the moment that really has encapsulated COP26, my first COP, by the way, I've never been to one of these before, but it was on the streets yesterday, one of the 100,000. And it was a really interesting day, right? So the feeling was that there was rain and it was cold, and it was almost every time there was rain that came, people got even more excited and louder. Like, it was extraordinary how the weather and the mood on the street was synchronized in an extraordinary way. And when you ask the question of naming the moment, or how I internalize it, is like feeling the moment where I felt it so profoundly was there was this moment where, after having a huge downpour, like just tons of cold rain coming down, and people are smiling and laughing, all of a sudden the sun came out. Cool. And there was this just extraordinary rainbow. Seriously? Across the sky. And I just, even thinking about it, I'm getting goosebumps. But it is this sense that actually there's something bigger that's also happening around us right now. I think this is a moment that really, really matters. And I think the energy of the street meeting the imperfect energy that's at COP26 is, I think, something we need to all sort of lean into and figure out how we are bringing these different power forces together, because it's only by bringing these things together that we're really going to meet the challenge ahead of us. And again, I come back to this rainbow, because what's beautiful about a rainbow, right, is that it's what occurs when you've got both sun and rain happening at the same time. And there's something about that metaphor of the both and. You know, I think we should be hopeful about what we can achieve, and we must be rooted in the urgency of this moment. We must be thinking about the collective work we must do collaboratively and the individual actions. We must be thinking about the different forms of power in many different places. And rather than dividing between them, we must be thinking about ways we reflect them together, just like the rainbow.
Fantastic.
Can I just say that being excited by miserable weather is like a really good definition of Scottishness? Welcome to our country.
It's a Canadian, it's Scottish thing, you know, it's a northern thing.
You'll fit right in.
Yeah.
So I think, insofar as one is capable of naming this moment, I think I think one of the things you're seeing is the insufficiency of the COP process, right? It's kind of core incompetence. And I think the idea that we predicate a lot of importance when what happens, and we're seeing the fullest extent of what is possible in these type of convocations. Right? I saw John Kerry speak the other night, and he was asked what he felt about Greta, and he said, I think Greta's great, and I think it's right that she's angry. But he also admitted the sort of insufficiencies of the things that he wanted to do versus the things that he was capable of doing. The kind of people back in the domestic US market that he has to be accountable to, and he has to push through, right? So there's a sense in which these formal processes, I think, have proven to be insufficient, and I think that's the kind of point of clarity. But I am encouraged. When I saw Kerry, there's no question. He's a good guy. He wants to do good things. He's just locked into a system that is not working. So I feel like there's a nice recognition for me in there that actually, like a few years ago, the climate science denialism, it was much more kind of mainstream. Is now that moment has passed. It seems like everyone's on the same page.
So maybe what we need is a kind of conversation that hasn't been taking place before, what we might call conscious conversations, or you in leading a program with Kim Pullman during COVID called imaginal conversations. you take just 30 seconds to describe the kinds of conversations that you were organizing, and then I want to see if we can do one around the topic.
Well, I think the conversations that Kim Pullman led with Reboot last year were about a recognition, I think, of, we're all scared, right? And even the bad guys are scared. And that everyone, when people are scared, they make bad decisions, right? They're boxed into a corner. And especially if you vilify people, then they tend to act badly, okay? So the Reboot works the principle of the golden rule, which is about reciprocity to oneself and to the planet. So the idea of it is, how could we, in some of the most fractured, polarized times that we exist in, where it seems impossible with, in the UK, which I know well, or in the US, people are at very different opposite ends of the political spectrum and find it impossible to speak to each other.
So tell us how you did a different kind of conversation, and then I want to ask Shar and Raj, what are the kinds of conversations you're involved in that you think are life-giving or idea-generating, which are probably not the typical ones? So
we started the conversations right in the first month of the pandemic, and what we found was there was a willingness. Initially, we'd hoped to have people around a dinner table, but we brought them into Zoom rooms and basically asked them kind of core questions about bereavement, about nature, about how they engage with their children or their parents, how they think about time. So these are questions which are, I guess, questions of philosophy, which we don't really have a space for. So, people don't have that kind of sense of religious undertaking anymore, and we're not selling religion, but we want to give people a space where they can talk about that connectedness. And what we found was there was a massive appetite for it. Okay, people really fell into it, and some really hardened business leaders got triggered, I think, in private, discrete spaces. And what we also found, one of the insights was that it's possible to have that sense of intimacy in a Zoom room. So that's a new territory as well, right? So what we're doing here now at COP is the first example of that year of Zoom rooms that we've had, where we basically define success as people bursting into tears, right? And we had a lot of that. So actually saying, well, how can we correlate that emotional breakthrough into real action at the speed at which it's required?
That's a great transition. Turning an emotional reality and authenticity into action. Have either of you been involved in or led that kind of conversation at some point in your career? But what are conscious or life-giving conversations? Because your opening comment suggests we need that. How do you do it?
I think that bringing together unlikely voices to share their testimonies is one of the most important things we can be doing right now. I remember, and next year we'll be halfway to the Sustainable Development Goals. I remember not so long ago we were halfway to the Millennium Development Goals. And we organized what we called poverty hearings, where we brought farmers from Kenya together with some of the poorest women living in the city of New York, together with Archbishop Ngani and Mary Robinson and others to listen to their testimonies. And what was fascinating was when they connected with each other, the Kenyan farmers felt deep compassion for the women in New York who were homeless, because in some ways the conditions that they had to grapple with were relatively more difficult to deal with than the Kenyan farmers who woke up to the sun and felt joy in their hearts each day. And so there's something about human connection that breaks these barriers down, breaks the paradigm, breaks the programming that we have, that we need to deconstruct in a way if we are to reconstruct the future. And what I think is powerful about the imaginal conversations or the conscious conversations is that for so many of these large conferences that we're in, there's grandstanding and there's commitments and there's pledges, and it comes from a place of, in a way, it comes from a place of ego. It doesn't necessarily come from a place of love. And the golden rule, if anything, is about, and when I hear Kim talking about it, she's adapted it slightly by saying, treat people and the planet the way you want to be treated. I mean, I don't think there's anything in that anyone could disagree with. And it's a principle for humanity. And I think that's where we need to get back to, is what are our principles?
Yeah, okay, that's where we want to go next. Shar, do you want to comment on that?
No, it's okay.
Okay. So I'd actually like to do what Raj just asked us to do. There's a phrase that came out of the Imaginal Conversations that you guys organized called Values for a Life Economy. And maybe you can describe how that came out of the Golden Rule discussions, and then I want to see where you guys would take it. If all you knew was that title, and against the backdrop of your work and life experience, how would you interpret that phrase, Values for a Life Economy? That's what I want to ask you. Can you just tell us where that came from?
So over the process of lockdown, we had a series of reasonably intensive facilitated discussions with a number of different thought leaders, business leaders, essentially in that same sort of attic room that we were all trapped in through lockdown, and found that there was a very busy discursive space, and that people were taking this as a point of inflection, right? And that out of this emerged a kind of consensus about, well, what is important to us, right? So it turns out that the daily commute wasn't as important as we thought, but people were rediscovering kind of family links and familial links and a sense of emotional attachment dispensation. So from that sense of epiphany, we started to formulate 10 kind of key principles that emerged around what is necessary to achieve a life economy. And just to clarify, we take the phrase life economy from John Perkins' work on the death economy, which is essentially the modus operandi that we're trapped in just now. So we're committed to a death economy. And Perkins says that, you know, every organization, I dare say everyone who works for a business or an NGO or a charity is committed to year-on-year growth. Everyone, right? GDP has to grow year on year. That's how we define success. That's how our governments do it. That's how our institutions do it. On a world with finite resources, right? So there's that's cognitive dissonance writ large. Okay, those two things don't stand. So that's a death economy. We're in a death spiral, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the values that are going to help us step out of that and look to different models and different ways of activating ourselves and different ways of self-organizing? That's a life economy. Now you can call it a circular economy. You know, what's interesting about being in this space just now is that lots of people are kind of emerging into the same kind of thought space as well. So it's one of a number of terms that are emerging. But for us, life economy is simple and communicable, and it suggests a system which is committed to enhancement and enrichment of ourselves.
So I want to watch you guys dig down deeper into that, because when I hear the word economy, like economics, like economic globalization or neoliberal economics, it's not a happy-making tone. You're using it in a positive sense. Is it a no to everything that we're doing currently, or is there a kind of transition, a bridging in your mind as you think about this phrase, values for life?
You know, when you speak about a death economy, it reminds me of a friend of mine who's a historian, Baron Claiborne, and he always reminds me that a mortgage means to the death. But what I also think is important for us while we're here in Scotland to remember is that the current economic system was based upon a set of principles. And we may have decided which of those principles we wanted to focus on in designing and developing the current economy that we have. But Adam Smith, before he wrote Wealth of Nations, wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that he said, how selfish soever a man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his character that interest him in the fortunes of others, that render their happiness necessary to him, though he gains nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it.
Beautiful quote.
He basically said that our economic system should be based on altruism, on love. And if you look around, we don't see an economic system based on those principles. We don't see an economic system that has the compassion it needs to have to deal with the distributional effects that have been created to leave so many people behind. And for me, I think what we really need to do, and what this generation is demanding of us, is to get back to the heart of our economy and figure out what is it that business is here to do. The corporation was set up for a very specific reason. It was set up for community benefit, to move goods and services around in ways that we couldn't do in small groups. Mm-hmm. But somewhere along the road, we've lost our way, and I think people like Charmian and others are kind of shining a light.
So where does that take you? The
another way
heart
forward,
of our economy. I saw your body, you smile when Raj used that word.
The heart of the economy, I did, because actually what was going through my head was so many songs that have love and heart. And I know we're going to speak a little bit later on about art and culture and the importance of that in this framing.
Do it now if you want.
Well, I'll leave that for the other point, but the reason why you saw me smile is I think I had some songs going through my head about love and heart and thinking about how those songs reflect some of the moments that we're in.
Where did that phrase take you, Char? Values for a life economy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went in a few different places. I actually was quite struck with your articulation of really what we have right now, which is a paradox, essentially, right? This is a paradox where, we do have this sense of we have to have continual exponential levels of growth whilst knowing we're on a finite planet with finite resources. And when we talk about it a little bit at the business school, and I should claim I'm not an economist, I am an art historian, but we have some really extraordinary conversations with students who are economists, and let's be clear, actually I learn more from them than I teach. But when we begin talking at the beginning of this course on regenerative and circular economy, we often start with a picture of an Escher painting, right? Or a drawing, Escher drawing, not painting, but an Escher drawing. Because he would draw optical illusions that looked like a paradox, and that was the backstop of or that's the framing that we used to start thinking about, well, why and how can we disrupt what this seems to be an unfathomable image to try and process this idea of exponential growth on a finite planet. And there's a really wonderful academic at Oxford who wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago, and his whole approach to this piece was actually how do we address the paradox? And there's 3 steps he wrote about. He wrote about first, we have to confront it. So we have to call it out, and that's what we are all doing right now, right? Confront it. Then you need to accept it exists, and that's really important. So it's not just like seeing it and confronting it, but just knowing it's there. And it's only then that you can begin to transcend it. And you transcend it by being really open and finding collaborative relationships. So Raj and I have worked together on many projects, like the Movement of Movements project, but this idea of transcending it by working with others. So that's what went through my mind. It was just a little bit more operational, I think, to the values conversation, which is how do we implement it? How do we begin sort of processing it? And I think education and engaging with people that are in business schools right now is crucially important. Not being afraid to call out the paradox, because it's there, and knowing that that's part of the journey we need to be going on in order to address it. But the other thing that a piece I read a couple of years ago that really inspired me was a piece from the World Economic Forum, which said, so often we anchor our thinking around economics in macro and micro, right? It's like the macro side of like what are the regulations, and then the micro, which is the individual decisions. Again, I'm not an economist, so there's probably a lot more you can go into in each of those. But what this piece proposed actually was that is a fairly binary way of looking at a fairly complex field of study, and actually there's a lot of other layers here. And in particular, they talked about the need to look at meta-economics, which is the economics of the system, actually, which holds the macro and the micro, and this magic that exists in what they call mesoeconomics. And the meso layer is the web of both formal and informal contracts and relationships we have with one another, we have with institutions, we have within families, with businesses. And I think that's the place that I'm kind of interested in tucking into a little bit more. And actually, I'd love to understand more about how, values-led economy, how that becomes alive in the meso layer as well as the meta.
So what does that spark in you guys?
What's sparking in me right now is a quote which says that our outer world is but a reflection of our inner world. And it's the only dimension I'd like to add to what Char beautifully just articulated, which is that I believe that our biggest challenge right now is that leaders, and not just leaders, people everywhere are focusing so much on how they can change the world outside, not recognizing that if we can only change ourselves, then perhaps we can change our communities, our families, and then we can start to change the world around us. And it's difficult to change ourselves. We all fail at it every single day, in every single way. But we have to find new ways of doing that, and that's part of our education system. And I think some of that fell away during the Enlightenment era. In Scotland, may be to blame for some of that, because we changed our system and we separated out some of the values and the spiritual principles that were at the core of education in order to separate church and state. But in that, we lost the values of empathy and compassion, and some of the most innovative schools now are bringing back in order to help young people fulfill their potential.
I'm not sure we know how to talk about the inner dimension. It makes us awkward. That's where this word spiritual, which is bandied about, both loved and hated, seems to come in. How would you we started with a question about economics, and you have taken us to the inner dimension, both of you, and I think that's fascinating. How do we integrate this? I'm hearing the sun and the rain all over again. Like, how to bring them together?
So I'm not going to dunk on the Enlightenment, because I'm a big fan of the Enlightenment. But
It's in your heritage.
and the medicines and all that, it's all good. I'm interested in, we talk a lot about systems change, right? What does that mean, and how do you find your place within it? I think so pre-Enlightenment, certainly the big organizing principles were around faith, right? So that, Tom Holland writes about, how Christianity has been the big kind of motivational force, just getting people organized and coherent and getting them all moving in the same direction, and picking crops at the same time, and all turning up to the same place. So that there's something where I think that has definitely been maligned and neglected, and it's like a muscle that you have to exercise. We have to kind of rework it. I'm interested in that sense of a kind of the muscularity of it. Like, actually, it's something you have to. It's hard work, and actually, when you kind of drill down to it, it has to be deeply kind of practical. So part of my concern would be that when we talk about faith or values-based action or faith-based action, we sort of retreat into a kind of narcissism, which is, how I feel. Well, climate change makes me feel really bad. So that's me done, right? And now I can book my ticket and fly wherever I like. So I'm interested in how the big coherent principles are emerging and arising, and I think part of me, the golden rule, is about this idea of reciprocity, and it's about actually working at what me and Raj can do, or any of us can do. What's the point where we actually start to do the work with each other as well?
Feels like what you've set in motion is a movement from economics as we learn it in standard business schools to an inner dimension, and then you're inviting us to complete the loop. You say not the inner dimension of narcissism, which is how I feel about things, but something internal but also reciprocal at the same time. And I'm interested how you guys would see, if this is where you're going, that movement inward, that movement back outward to principles, values, and action. I think that's where you launched this, or am I missing something here?
No, I feel, and I think it's okay to feel.
It's okay. On this stage,
we are feeling creatures. That's what separates us in some ways from inanimate objects, although they may feel too, we don't quite know. But I feel that we have to create an environment in which people are able to articulate what they believe in. And let's face it, there's no way we're going to win in the decisive decade without faith. Because what we're trying to accomplish requires sources of strength from all places that we have to harness. And it's not like this hasn't been done before. I mean, civilizations before us have accomplished great feats. And what we need to do in the next 10 years is a great feat. We need to transform almost every single part of our society to remove carbon, to transform our education systems. And Kim talks about this. It's not just about emissions. It's about so many parts of our way of life that's not working. And it's the Sustainable Development Goals too. I mean, those goals don't just challenge us to deal with the climate change targets. They also challenge us to ensure gender equality. They also challenge us to ensure that there's a fair share of value being created throughout our economic system. So all of these require us to look inside at what we value, look at the principles that are organizing across our society, and figure out what is it that we all share. And for me, my biggest hope in coming to this COP was in fact post the pandemic, or in the wake of the pandemic, that perhaps this would be a moment of truth and reconciliation and more of a peace negotiation than necessarily another climate negotiation, because the Paris Agreement actually established a lot of what we needed. And I still think we need that moment. I think what we saw yesterday was the beginning of a process. As we look into 2022, 30 years after the Rio Summit, 50 years since the very first time that the world came together for a conference on the human environment, halfway to meeting the SDGs, I see that there's a potential for us to come together in a moment of truth and reconciliation, which is about reparation, which is about recognizing that there's intergenerational injustice, and we don't talk about those things.
Yeah.
We don't heal, and if we don't heal, there's no way we're going to win on some of these
Part
issues.
of the moving in is a healing. Char, where was that taking you?
Again, I'm coming back and forth to the arts. I keep on coming back to the arts.
Let's go there.
Yeah. I'm reading some really interesting science fiction right now, which is like a really kind of interesting genre.
Dare you tell us?
Well, there's a few. I've actually, I've been reading quite a few of them. Been reading a lot of Kim Stanley Robinson, who's here.
Ministry of the Future.
Ministry of the Future, New York 2140, and he's
Okay.
actually got some other beautiful pieces he's written, Aurora and the Green Earth trilogy. Oh, and so I've been devouring these over the last year, just enjoying the sort of ability to think into the future and really sort of stretch thinking. But I took a break from Kim Stanley Robinson because I finished this last book, and I got into an author named Octavia Butler.
Yes, I just read my first book by Octavia Butler.
Did you? Which one? Which one?
The very first one of the
Parable of the
Sower.
The Sower. Okay,
Comes
so I
first.
think I've skipped the Sower, and I think I'm in another one. But anyways, I'm reading the one of the Parable books, and I'm Earthseed. I don't know if that's in.
Earthseed, that's correct. That's the core idea.
That's the
of
core
her
idea.
vision.
So
This
I'm
is an African American author writing in the 1980s and 90s, and just a stellar author.
Extraordinary.
Highly recommended. Octavia Butler.
Octavia Butler, and I read Kindred first, which is a beautiful story.
So relevant, Char. It's so relevant to our situation.
Please tell us a little bit more
Well,
about this.
you've been reading it as well, so maybe
Yeah.
we can be
Yeah,
in
you go first, you
conversation
go
about
first.
it a little bit. But I think this idea that she's proposed in Earthseed, which is a fairly dystopic future we end up in, and yet there's this core of people that come together around this idea, which is loosely based on a faith and a religion. But what sits behind it is why it's so important to have one in a time of chaos and of things falling apart and disintegrating and challenging and the worst in people coming out in many places. And the way that the character, who's the sort of protagonist in this piece, talks about her commitment to this idea of a calling that brings people together is that we need to have something bigger than who we are as individuals to bring us together. And I think that, to me, the way she describes, this approach and how do you get people to connect with this bigger vision and how do you get them to feel it? Anyways, that's what was coming to mind for me in this conversation was this work of Octavia Butler.
We're in an era where religion we think of as divisive or as the cause for the problems, and here's this 16-year-old girl who says we need an earth-centered religion. I can't find one, I'll invent one. And then as I walk with no place to live, people gather together around these values until they find a farm in Northern California, where I come from.
I haven't finished the book.
Oops, sorry.
Spoiler alert.
But begin to live an earth-centered religion with their hands on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And the spirituality, the internal dimension, the values that all of you are talking about, can we be brave enough to speak of something that bonds us together for the service of this planet that we need to live in?
For me, the biggest struggle, to be honest, has been a personal struggle. So, my parents grew up in Kenya. One was raised Muslim, one was raised Hindu. They became Christians because they went to school in Kisumu, in a village where missionaries came from Canada to support poor people living in those villages to learn the faith. And so I was raised in a Christian home, and then I married my wife, who was Hindu, and then we faced this whole deconstruction and struggle around how do you live in a society where there are so many norms and so many historical frameworks that have been built around who can love who, and you start to recognize that there are so many parts of our faith traditions that we haven't been able to properly look at because we've not been given the space to look at them. And then you realize that you grow up in schools where you might learn the basics about religion, but you don't actually learn about having the permission to explore one's own belief system. And so I think that ultimately, if we are to take this line of inquiry. I think what we need to do is empower and support people to walk their own spiritual path.
Beautiful.
And that, you know, I just became a father 12 weeks ago. I don't think that you can become a father and hold this little bundle of life in your hands, and Char's a mother too, without knowing that there's something sacred in that relationship, and that there's something sacred in the relationship that we have with all forms of life.
Yeah.
And for us not to explore that, which we have the privilege of understanding more than others, perhaps, or other forms of life, I think would just be such a great loss. Particularly in this moment where we're seeing ecosystems, 80% of them declining because of our impact on life.
It feels like we're transitioning from that inner place of authentic values to the question of how do we find each other? And you at Reboot the Future are using this concept of imaginal communities. Can you say something about that? And it'd be really interesting to see where it takes the other two. We finding each other after the moment of birth, the moment of reconnecting with the earth, the moment of awareness of that we're heading toward Death Star, right? How do we find each other? How do we become a vibrant community that then can carry about transformative action? What is this concept that you guys introduced?
So imaginal cells are part of the ethos and the myth making within Reboot, but they are a hard, verifiable scientific process that happens in the larval stage of a caterpillar, and with a cellular level, these small microscopic entities emerge as this indeterminate form of the pupae starts to kind of undergo its metamorphosis, and it exists in a dormant state. It's there latently within the cell, and then it emerges, and then others emerge, and then as these kind of nodes start to interconnect, then you get the crystalline structure that generates the butterfly. And what's interesting about this is that these microscopic entities, the imaginals, they appear autonomously, and then they start to network. So it's not about the individual, it's not about the collective, it's the power of the networked state that becomes emergent and powerful.
Cool.
So I'm reminded of, you know, there's a book about a guy in the last days of the Soviet Russia in 1989, just before the revolution. And he said, and the book is called something like, "Everything was really normal until it suddenly wasn't," you know? Translated from the Russian. And it says there's two stages to the revolution, right? One is when you individually realize that something's not working, like the guy in the TV isn't telling you the truth, right? And that your electricity, you know, the system is failing for you. And then the second stage is when you realize everyone else is thinking the same thing, right? Mm. And then you take to the streets,
yes.
Right? And that's where we are now, but not just within the Soviet Union. We're on a planetary level. Everyone here is like pulling the levers and going, gee, well, look, this thing doesn't work like it's meant to, like the guy in the shop said it would, right? That's where we're at just now. And so all of a sudden you go to your next door neighbor and say, well, what do we do together now, right?
So how do we find each other? If we're imaginal cells becoming conscious, how do we begin to become stronger through community?
Can I answer a slightly different question, but
Any
I do want to
question
build on this, because actually this is something that Raj and I have done some work on together, which is exactly using this idea of the levers. Like, we know there are those levers that we need to pull in order to drive systems change. Some of those levers are regulatory and policy levers. Some of them are culture levers. I mean, systems change isn't one of the things where here's the button you push and job done, right? Like, there is a range of different interventions that are going to be needed, and the coordination of pulling those levers at the same time to make the change happen is, I think, the job that needs to get done. And recognizing that not one organization can pull that lever. It's rested in place. Like, that's why you can't get it to move, is because it is so incumbent and embedded in how our current models are working. The only way I think we are going to be able to get those levers pulled is recognizing who's working on policy, who's working on culture change, who's working on reinventing business education, and getting them to coordinate and all put their hands on that lever at the same time and pull. Yeah. And that was the hypothesis, right?
That's what the Decisive Decade report was all about.
Absolutely. And the work we did around the movement of movements was, let's just map and see who are these different movement organizations and which levers are they trying to pull, and then let's figure out how we get them to work together. But I also want to I actually have a question I'd like to ask you, and I'm not sure if it's scientific or not, but I'm so interested in this metaphor of the imaginal cells. And I guess my question is, do you think the caterpillar and the larvae, do they know they're going to become a butterfly? Like in the spirit of consciousness, do they know they're on the journey? Because I remember reading The Hungry Caterpillar to my kids.
Yes.
And what happens in The Hungry Caterpillar is the caterpillar knows something's happening, and so eats, and like, eats a lot. And then it goes into its cocoon, and then it comes out as the butterfly. And I'm trying to find some comfort in that story of a children's book that we all have overconsumed. But do we know, if we are in this metaphor, do we know that this change is happening? Do we know we're about to become a butterfly?
So what this process is called phase transition, right? That's the scientific term. And phase transition is when one system changes into another system. So the most direct way of looking at that is when water is boiled and it turns into steam. And between those two stages, there is something incoherent that is that cannot be predicted, right? And the patterns that form in that stage are undetectable. You cannot define what's going to happen between those stages. And phase transition is something that happens in grasslands. It happens in mice populations. It's exactly the same thing, where all of a sudden there's an indeterminacy in the system, and that becomes, I think, both scary but also kind of but full of possibility.
Can I add a word to that and just see where it takes you? So I work in emergent complexity in biology, and what you find is that the principles of the previous, say the caterpillar biology, points toward a transition, but those terms aren't sufficient to describe the emergent level. What happens is you need a new vocabulary to describe a living cell. You can't do it from biochemistry alone. So you get up to the cusp, you see there's change coming, but then it takes a new vocabulary, the biologist will say, to be able to describe what comes out the other end.
What do you mean by vocabulary?
So a new theoretical system, or maybe in this case, you guys, now you go with it, a system of values, a new social organization, a new, how will you apply that to this transition? Because the biology won't tell us anything more than that.
I think you have to say it's going to be exciting. It's like we're all freshmen.
It's going to be exciting as hell, but we don't know what.
We're all freshmen, right? We're all here. It's the first day at college. You're finding new people. You're reinventing your identity. You're leaving behind the person you were at school. You start to say, well, these are my new interests. These are the new kind of ways I want to express who I am. So that's the way to view it. In answer to your question, does the caterpillar know? No, it doesn't, but the system knows.
The system knows.
And you can, that's verifiable because because it always happens, right? We know, we trust in that process. But for the pupae, it can't be a particularly comforting process. I feel really sleepy, I don't know what's going to happen next. But the system knows.
The only thing I would say that we need to be very conscious of is that as these stages of development evolve, right? And I think we're seeing changes in, models of growth even. Rostow's 5 stages of development, for example. I think, for example, some places in the world during the pandemic have not seen rural-urban migration, they've seen urban-rural migration. But at the same time, if you look in the global south, many people still haven't experienced the parts of this current system that create the minimum level of takeoff that provide a society their basic needs. And so what I think is happening is we're at a risk of kind of a dislocation, where you start to see the evolution of 2 parallel systems, and how we manage that, I think, is going to be really a real question, because what we then could end up with is a clash of civilizations, a clash of systems, where one system blames the other system, but in fact this system had actually evolved out of that old system. And it's been very easy for countries that have burned their fossil fuels, built their infrastructure, created their roads, to now transition because they've created a lot of what they need.
They're like the hungry caterpillar, who's done all its eating and consuming.
They've done it all, and they can become butterflies. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it's bad to be a caterpillar. And so I think there's an irony here that we have to reconcile. And we have to find a space, and that's where perhaps these conscious conversations are so important. Okay. But they have to be conversations that bring to the table those communities, those fishing populations, those farmers, those people who day in, day out make the current system what it is and make our lives function the way that they do. Because we forget the value chain that we're all part of, and that's a human value chain.
Yeah, so we've got to, I think the key thing here is we've got, whenever we have these convocations, we've got to ask who's not here, who did we forget to invite, right? And actually here at Glasgow, there's quite a lot of people here. John Kerry said, and I heard it again and again, the people we need to engage are the billionaire philanthropists, government and business, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what about everyone else? Like,
maybe we need more hungry caterpillars at the table and not just satiated caterpillars.
Can I share a little?
Well, actually, we should move to our closing. So maybe I could ask you, and you could work it into the. I just want to ask you each a somewhat more personal question in your position of leadership and influence. Two, and I'll bet you can work it in. Shara always does. Many civil society leaders like yourselves are saying that they want to redouble their efforts when they leave COP26. What will you do differently after this moment? This is a moment in time. This is a moment history is going to look back on. Did something happen on Monday? Or fail to happen on Monday, the 8th of November? This is that pause. It's like the Holy Saturday for the Catholic tradition. I'm not a Catholic, but this waiting point. Or maybe that moment when the cocoon is formed, but there's no movement of any butterfly yet. We're at this cusp moment, I think. What will you do differently? What will you emphasize more? What do you hope to emphasize in your various leadership roles over the coming months and years?
I'll jump in.
Go for it.
And I'm going to try and work in both points.
You will too.
Let's try. So the thing that I've been really inspired by is the businesses actually that are interested in changing and evolving and moving into more of the activist space. And there's a few things that are interesting about that. One is those businesses that are actually seeing what is needed and using that as their North Star rather than being limited just what feels possible. And I'm afraid that that's what there is a sort of feeling of, I think, in sort of some of the more formal spaces is what's possible. And it's like, we know what's needed, actually. The science is telling us what's needed and our hearts are telling us what's needed. Like, we know that. So businesses that are getting that and are using that as their guide. And I'm really excited to see businesses that are saying we know we need to activate in different ways. And so that their leadership model is coming up to say, how do we as businesses support people to get out on the streets? So companies like Ecosia and Patagonia, which actually pay the legal fees for their employees that are incarcerated due to nonviolent civil disobedience in order to encourage people to show up and be there and count. And it's rooted in some research by Erica Chenworth, who's a researcher who's been looking at social movements over the years. And what she found is that if you can get 3.5% of the population engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience, there has never been a time in history where that change, that serious level of systemic political change has not happened. So for me, it's really important to see how we can get businesses to get behind this and use their incredible power, yes, in terms of their business models and their abilities to influence change and to stand up for things that matter, and also to get their people out there and engaging in this moment. Because if we can use businesses as a channel to get that 3.5% of the population engaged, I think we are going to be rocking and rolling. So activist businesses is the thing that I'm really hoping to double down on. And I want to be really clear because the word leadership has come up a few times. And I don't think this is leadership in the traditional sense. This has got to be much more.
This is important. Say that.
It's much more about service, because one of the things in leadership, in movements, is that leadership has a very different definition than I think what we see as like people that are on a panel, moved by ego, right? Like we've seen on the panels like where people are like, here's what we're saying and here's what we're doing. And I'm still figuring this out myself, what I really think about it, because I think there is the need for people to be out in front and provide guidance, but it has to be in such a way that people follow and come along. And I think in the movements that I'm seeing, leadership has a different look and feel than I think what we see
that feels important
in some of the other spaces. Yeah. So activist businesses that are willing absolutely to take a stand, to use their business as a tool for activism, not activism as a tool for their business, that is a really important line. But ultimately to find ways to use their power of their business to drive change and to get people to engage. And I am going to wrap in the other point that I did want to respond to in this, because one of the conversations I've been across and I'm really excited by is the work around the citizens' assemblies, which is about really understanding that there is a need to make sure that people are a part of providing the recommendations and engaged in the process for the decisions that are going to be made, the commitments that are going to be made, and the investments that are going to be followed. And I think it's really important for that mandate, for that change, to not just be coming from people who have the privilege of being in this space, but it should be coming from citizens around the world. So I would just say check out the Global Citizens Assembly. I am a big fan of that model, and I'm certainly backing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely need new forms of leadership. And, you know, I remember in my last few weeks at the B team, and we were trying to find a successor, and I'd put together a job description. And maybe enough time has passed that it's okay that I say this. And I'd said, we're looking for someone with servant leadership. And I remember in the board meeting, someone said to me, what is this term, servant leadership? And I knew at that point in time, I made the right decision that it was time for me to transition. But I do think that's part of this transition, right? Like, leadership is also about service. If you look at Mahatma Gandhi, right, who for me as a Gujarati is one of my heroes.
Of course.
You know, he served the people. He went to make salt. He performed acts of resistance, but which were acts also of empowerment. And so I think we can also draw inspiration from history.
Yeah.
The three things that I would focus on as I look forward, one I think is about telling the truth. I think we have to expose the contradictions of the system that we're living in. And it's incumbent upon us, those of us who have education, to use that education to understand how this system is not working, who it's working for and who it's not working for, and how we can help to address some of those injustices that we see. So telling the truth is critical, and I think seeing young people in movements like Extinction Rebellion and others bringing us back to that principle, I think is absolutely critical. There's nothing wrong with telling the truth.
No.
We're living in such a litigious society right now that we've forgotten that telling the truth is a core part of what it means to be a good human being. The second, and Charlotte alluded to this, is to make your money matter. If you have the privilege of having money, make sure you use it wisely. And that means choosing what you consume based upon the values that you have and that you hold dear. And I think you see the next generation of young people, you know, some of them walking around with spreadsheets saying, not buying from them, and I will buy from them. And it's fascinating, because that means our current economy is going to look very different if we look 10, 15, 20 years, even 2 or 3 years ahead. I think a number of companies are going to start to fall because there's just simply not a demand.
Yeah.
And if there's no demand, there's not going to be any supply. So use your money wisely. And the third thing for me, I think, is coming back to the golden rule. I do think we all have to start treating each other and the planet the way we want to be treated. And if we can all start doing a bit of that, things will start to get a little bit better. And that comes back to the question of compassion and love. And it's okay for us to feel. It's okay for us to have conversations like this. And I think, you know, we need to create the space in business, in academia, in some of the most unlikely of settings, in the investor community, in governments, in primary schools, for people to talk about these topics. And lastly, I would say that if you look at the societies that were formed before us, they were formed because people spent the time philosophizing, figuring out what they stood for, not just what they stood against. We spend so much time standing against things, and we do need to define what, you know, we don't want to be moving forward with, but we need to come up with what we stand for. And I'm not seeing enough at this COP,
That's for sure.
and even on the streets, to be honest, that translates the anger in our hearts into a vision for what we want to build and create together. And that's what I think the next 12 months needs to be about.
There you go. A last brief question for each one of you. Anthony, Raj, and Char. You talked in the beginning about the rainbow and the two components. Well, frankly, it's a time of a lot of hard, cold rain that drenches a lot of spirits and leaves them cold and shaking. But what's come across in listening to the three of you is that there is a sun behind the clouds. We are not at a place, the apocalypse has not arrived, this is not over. And in that situation of a lot of cold rain and the sense that there is a sun, a guide, a chance for transformation, what gives you hope? What gives you hope?
So what I would say is pessimism is a luxury that we can't afford, right? And I'd like to quote quote from the Shawshank Redemption here, where the guy says, "Get busy living or get busy dying." Right. So optimism is something that we are hardwired for. And actually, you know what? Dig deep, do the work, get busy. That's the rainbow is only achieved after a lot of industry.
Beautifully said. Raj?
You asked me for what I see, and Shar spoke about rainbows and rain, and what I'm seeing right now is this story that we all heard when we were little, of an ark.
Oh, yes.
And you know, we always thought that this ark was this ship that a few people got to be on and the rest were left to die. But the epistemological rooting of the word ark is ARK and ARC, also the ark.
Oh.
And the ark is the rainbow.
It is the rainbow.
And everyone
Sweet.
focuses on this boat, the ship that Noah stewarded. And you know, across some of the world's biggest faiths, people share this story, but they focus so much on this ark. And yes, we need to build an ark, but we also need to focus on this ark.
Beautiful.
And this arc is a journey. It's the same as the arc of the moral universe that bends towards justice, but it only bends towards justice if people take action.
Yeah.
And I think this is a moment for people to take action. And that's what is in my heart right now, is how do we build a movement of movements where we bend that arc at the pace and scale that we need in this decisive decade, so that we can both address poverty and inequality and raise the floor, but also make sure that we're staying within the ceiling in terms of the planetary boundaries.
Fantastic answer. Fantastic.
I love
Sure.
it. I'm actually seeing the arc, and of course the shape of the arc is almost, you know, in how it's drawn often, it's just this arc of a boat, actually, so that there's the echo of the two shapes.
Symmetry.
I'm going to sort of respond a little bit with some words that have inspired me as well. I love that we've actually been spending some time on vocabulary, and you use that in terms of the place we need to go next. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on some words to sort of think about that sort of future vocabulary. But a word I learned a few years ago, and Raj knows this because we've talked about it a lot before, but this word actually comes from botany, and it's the word heliotropy. And it refers to the tendency of plants to grow in the direction of the sun. And I do think about sunflowers a lot, actually, which is this idea that actually if you think of the video images of if you watch a time lapse of sunflowers in a field, that you can actually see the sunflowers following the sun across the sky. And I actually think we as humans are not that different than our friends in the flora community, that we also will grow taller and stronger and faster together when we are motivated by things that are full of warmth and light and positivity. And so I would just sort of add to what Raj has said, that I think the action that we needs to be driven by a vision for what we are growing towards. But I also want to just sort of leave with a bit of a caution to this a little bit as well, which is has been shared with me by some of my friends in the activist community. But sunflowers don't just float up to the clouds, right? Sunflowers are grounded, and they are grounded into the soil in which they grow from. And we've been hearing this word radical a lot, you know, radical action, radical collaboration. But the origin of the word radical is rooted. And actually, that's what sunflowers are. They are moved by the sun, and they are rooted. They are rooted to the soil in which they grow from. They are rooted to the communities. And if we want to take this into a metaphor that for all of us to think about, they are rooted to the science. They are rooted to the heartbeat of everybody on this planet. So I'm hopeful, because I think we are at a point where we can start really seeing that sun coming out. And we need to give shape to that vision so that we can help people all grow towards it. But as we do it, we must remain radical and rooted to the urgency to act now.
Beautiful. The circle is a sign of completion. The circle is the two half circles. The circle above of the sun, the hope. The circle below of the earth, the grounding for ourselves. The completion of the vision. Raj, Shar, Anthony, thank you for a beautiful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck in what lies ahead.
Thank you.